everyone. Welcome to the Cloud Data Protection and Disaster Recovery Summit. This event was organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, Virtualization and Cloud Review, and AWS Insider, who have brought together some of the best independent experts on today's topic. Many thanks to our sponsors, Metallic and Island, for making this event possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief of Application Development Trends at the Converge 360 Group at 1105 Media. Try to say that on your Friday. And I'll be your moderator for the first of 3 information-packed sessions. But before we get started, I need to go over a few housekeeping details. Each of today's sessions is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way within the next few days. Each of today's sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. You can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. Please feel free to add your questions as they occur to you throughout the summit. We'll do our very best to get to all of them. Our sponsors, Metallic and Island, have provided some extra resources that can be found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please take a moment to check those out. As you leave the summit today, you'll be asked to take a very short survey. We would greatly appreciate it if you could share your honest opinions. Our editors read every comment, and they help to shape our future events. And last but not least, at the end of the third session, one lucky attendee will be receiving an Alienware M15 gaming laptop. But to win this gorgeous machine, you must be present for the drawing, so stick with us. Now let's get started with our first session, the new cloud data security best practices. For this session, we've called on Joey D'Antoni, Principal Consultant at Denny Cherry and Associates Consulting. With more than a decade of IT experience at Fortune 500 companies, as well as expert certifications from Microsoft and VMware, Mr. D'Antoni is a well-known thought leader in cross-platform IT. He has worked extensively on data platforms and cloud technologies and has a high level of expertise in performance tuning, infrastructure, and disaster recovery. You are in for a great session. Take it away, Joey.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone, and welcome to today's summit. This is an interesting topic. John and I were kind of talking while we were in the waiting room before. It's ever evolving. There is just, like this week, there was a breach involving Okta, who's like a major multi-factor authentication and kind of identity management service as a service provider. And the breach I thought was rather interesting. Because it turns out the hackers were allegedly a group of teens who got arrested in the UK today. But what they had done was targeted not necessarily high-level people, but people with high-level permissions within Okta. Used credential stuffing to kind of guess their passwords, by the way. One of the reasons why, and this is kind of an aside from the summit talk, but you shouldn't reuse passwords across applications is if the password you used at, say, shadybusiness.com gets breached because they didn't have good security practice, and that's the same password or some variant of the password you use for your job, it becomes rather trivial for especially a motivated attacker to use that credential somewhere else. So they did that, and Okta had multi-factor authentication, of course, but what they did was, since they targeted 4 or 5 employees, they just kept flooding them with multi-factor authentication requests. And eventually, I think they were able to get somebody to approve one, and then they were in. And once you're in, then you can do stuff. So there's this constant stream of data breaches, ransomware attacks, and threat actors. I know one of the things that came out this week is the U.S. federal government is concerned about Russian attacks on our infrastructure. There's some guidance that they published around things you can do for that. And frankly, ransomware is a very profitable business too, and this is another key part of that, because these threat actors make a lot of money because of the way the whole business model works. Customers buy insurance to protect their data. A lot of times the insurance will simply pay the ransom. As you know, a lot of organizations don't invest the kind of money in security that they probably should. And that's a problem that I see, at least across organizations. So very common problems. Beyond that, we have really complex data systems, and we have really a lot of complexity in our information technology infrastructure. So it can be very challenging to get these things done and protect your data. And not only that, we don't have just one. It's not like one switch we click to say make everything secure. We're going to talk a little bit about encryption, and a lot of people think that's the switch, but it's not. That's not one part of a multi-layered defense. And doing things securely is really hard. The other thing I was mentioning to John yesterday was one of the kind of things that Microsoft is pushing a little bit in terms of security is moving away from passwords. And I know that's a little bit of a weird concept, but I set up at GCAC, our Azure Active Directory tenant, to be able to use password with authentication. And the way I did that was I had to enable a different type of token to be used, so a FIDO2 token, and that's a physical device token that I plug into my laptop. I can then authenticate against Azure with that token from my laptop and a PIN. So it's still two-factor authentication, but there's no password involved. However, I went to try to set that up for Google today, and Google does not support that as a primary method, so I still have to have a password. So even with those two pretty large vendors, you see kind of a wide variety of what's out there and what you can configure. So even if you have good methods, there's always going to be potentially some gaps, especially when you're working with third-party solutions. So let's get started and talk about some of the tips I have for you today. So I think this is kind of broken down into about 10 sections, and we're going to kind of walk through each of them. There's kind of some breakout from some of them. So one of the things you need to understand in the cloud is your shared responsibility model. And I'll just walk through these acronyms at the top in case everybody's not already familiar. I'm sure you are. But on-prem is your data center, or maybe a data center you rent. IaaS is infrastructure as a service. For the purposes of most definitions of infrastructure as a service, we're going to refer to cloud networking, storage, and virtual machines as infrastructure as a service. The lines, I think, a lot of times get blurred between infrastructure as a service and platform as a service. Platform as a service offerings are things like database as a service, or sorry, I work in databases, and I'm not going to be able to think of another one real quick. Website as a service, where you get a managed solution. So you get a managed website or a managed database, and that's your service. That's the service you're consuming. We call those things platform as a service. The big main difference there is if you're using infrastructure as a service, typically you're responsible for patching your stuff, whereas if you're using platform as a service, the vendor is responsible for patching your stuff, but I'll talk more about that in a second. And then finally, software as a service. And software as a service still has some security controls that you're responsible for. But for the most part, everything is handled by the vendor, and you have a lot less control. And examples of software as a service, just for your reference, are like Salesforce or Office 365 even. Anything where really you're just consuming a service. So, but back to the difference between on-prem and IaaS and PaaS, kind of in terms of security. So if you're on-prem, you're really responsible for everything. So that means when we talk about just patch stuff, like it's easy, which it's not, when you own your own hardware and potentially hypervisor, if you're running virtual, that's a lot more surface area that you're responsible for. So how frequently do you patch your BIOS? How frequently do you patch, whether it be VMware or Hyper-V to the latest releases? Those are all things you kind of have to think about in an on-prem world, and that's really the benefit of IaaS, is you only have to worry about the OS up. So anything up from the operating system is where you're patching. And even today, there are some at least preview offerings of versions of Windows Server that are going to be patched automatically if you're running in Microsoft Azure, for example. And I can't imagine that's not going to proliferate out further because there's so much demand around kind of automated patching. Platform as a service is kind of cool because you don't have to worry about any of that. The patching is all handled by your provider. For the most part, it's handled automatically. Some solutions may require you to choose like a patching window. I know, at least on the Microsoft side, where they own the code, they've worked to kind of really mitigate downtime for these sorts of things. AWS does too. They're also really solid at this, but they'll patch your, if you're running a managed an RDS database. They'll patch that automatically for you within a window that you've chosen. But the key thing with those PaaS solutions that you might not have to think about as much with IaaS solutions is they potentially have public endpoints. And we'll talk more about endpoints later, but you need to manage kind of the network security as to how those things work. Like the cloud provider will do some baseline network security to an extent, but you need to control who has access to those solutions. And obviously something like a website may be internet facing. Whereas a database, you don't need to have as many people access it typically. You're also responsible for identity and access control, and that applies to both like the control plane, so who can make changes to the service, and then who can do things within the service. And with software as a service, you're typically only responsible for making sure those endpoints are locked down and controlling roles and users and that kind of thing. So all these things are fairly similar, but the big thing is, you remember, just because you're in the cloud doesn't mean you don't have to necessarily patch anything. So understand your cloud provider. I think this is kind of another key aspect, and it kind of ties into the last slide, because that slide is generic for roles and responsibilities. I believe I took that graphic from Microsoft, but it's not exactly universal across all cloud services. Not all cloud services are exactly the same. The providers are all a little bit different. Where are their regions? So one of the kind of interesting things to me is that if there's ever like a major power outage in the Northern Virginia area, like how much generation capacity do Microsoft and AWS and Google have? Because they're all, if you're in US East, whether it be Amazon, Google, or Azure, you're probably within about a 20-mile or a 30-kilometer radius, depending on where you're from, of Dulles Airport, right? All those data centers are in that area. So understanding the regionality, how the regions are deployed, what the availability models are if a region goes down, because let's face it, typically we're going to see failures be regional, so you want to understand that. And then how you can deploy, your critical apps in a way that you're not going to lose data. You also want to understand, what's the situation? Is there a secondary region for your region? Is that where you should be protecting, sending back things like backups that need to be protected? You also want to understand what kind of access controls they have in place. To me, this is a little bit more of an audit checkbox. If you're using one of the major cloud providers, they have tier 1 data centers. They have to meet all the federal standards because they all have government offerings. So their access controls are very, very strong. I know, having worked at one of the cloud vendors and having had access to production systems there, the amount of hoops and security you have to jump through to get onto a production system is really unreal. It's 3 or 4 factor authentication, and you can only connect from a certain machine that you don't have access to anything else on, so the odds of that machine getting breached are very low. But still, especially if you're not working with one of the major providers, this is definitely a question you want to ask. Or if you're working with like a smaller co-location facility, asking about their access controls and security are definitely a big thing. The third point here is really more about the control plane and how you're accessing the cloud. Is do they support secure authentication methods? I mentioned yesterday that I configured token-based or key-based authentication for our Azure account, and I couldn't do it for Google. I don't know if I could do that for Google Cloud Platform. I know with AWS, when I authenticate, I have a secure shell key that I have to use. That's my private key that I use with them to log in. So presumably most of the major cloud providers do support these secure authentication methods to the control plane. But it is an important question to ask. And not only do they support it, but do you have the capabilities to implement them within your organization? Because sometimes that can be a little bit of a challenge too. We also, one of the other risks, and I think this is something that people are pretty scared of early in the cloud, and I think they're less scared of now that we've adopted, but how do you protect your data from the admins of the cloud? I mentioned some of the work I did at a provider. That's what you want to hear. You want to hear that, I had just-in-time access, so I could only get access with a ticket in place. So there had to be a ticket. I had to request my access based on that ticket. That access had to be approved. It was then temporary and logged fully. And of course, all the other security factors I mentioned that were in place. That's the way it should be. But it's a good question to ask when you're having talks with cloud vendors, and they should be, if they're doing their job, they should be absolutely happy to tell you exactly how they do that. And then finally, do they support their specific compliance needs? I did a lot of work in the pharmaceutical industry and in medical device for a long time. I worked for two of those firms for a while, and we had a lot of very specific compliance needs. Once again, this is something that the Googles, the Amazons, and the Microsofts of the world, I think they have more certifications than your data center does for sure. But if you're not working with one of those tier 1 providers, these are some questions you want to ask. Do they meet those? The government is the main driver, I think, for the big providers having met all of these various needs, but they also meet a lot of international standards around the world because they have clients in regions all around the world. So knowing that they do all that, understand what your compliance needs are, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later too, because it also applies to data retention. So this is my biggest one, and it's self-serving because I do as part of my job cloud training. But I think this is probably something that's vastly overlooked when people implement the cloud. If you're new to working with cloud resources, it's really easy, and especially if you don't have a very senior architect who's implemented a bunch of policies to keep you from, as we like to say, shooting yourself in the foot with a shotgun or blowing your leg off. It can be quite easy to do some really bad things. Like one of the things that I always yell at Microsoft about is when you build a VM in Azure through the GUI in the portal, the default is that it wants to give it a public IP address. And on top of that, it doesn't put any firewall rules in place, or as they're called there, network security group rules, to keep anybody from logging in. I think if you click next, I think the default is you might have to check a box to open port 3389, which is remote desktop for Windows, or 22 for secure shell for Linux. But it's only a single box check. It's not, and there is a warning on the screen, but don't give me a public IP address by default. And that's just one of many places where you can run into things you can do wrong that can be default. The other, we'll talk more about it later, but Amazon S3 data breaches, which are really, really common. So you want to make sure your IT staff really understands your cloud provider's security framework. And when I say security framework, this kind of breaks down into two things. You want to understand the roles and responsibilities of maintaining and building things in the cloud itself. So we commonly refer to that as the control plane, as to where you build things. And if you're coming from an on-prem world, you can think of this like VMware vCenter is your control plane for your environment. In AWS, it's the console, and Azure, it's the portal. These things are all API driven, so you want to understand who can do what in those areas, and what are the implications of other people being able to do things, and understand how that security model breaks down. It's fairly common, honestly, between all three clouds. So once you understand one really well, it's pretty easy to understand another one. But you want to make sure your IT staff understands all that. And then you also want them to understand where the foibles are, where are the mistakes they can make. I mentioned the public IP thing. In AWS, typically it's exposing an S3 bucket to the internet is another common one. But training your IT staff about the cloud provider is really important, because trust me, it's hard to find people with cloud experience right now, because they're all getting hired by cloud providers. You also want to train everyone in your organization about things like phishing attacks. And I know this is lame, and there's a lot of horror stories about the way businesses have tried to click here for your bonus, and it's actually a phishing attack. Don't do stupid things like that, but make sure your organization understands what phishing attacks look like. They're educated on them. It's a very, very common attack vector. It's very risky. The biggest mitigation to it either A, not having users click, which is not really realistic, but B, having some network protocols around locking down desktops so that they're not being able to talk to everything. But still, you don't want to get phishing attacked if you can avoid it. So make sure you have that kind of training for all of your users and not just your IT. This is the one that I've run into, especially in larger organizations, and where I've tended to run into it is as organizations get distributed and have field offices. The field offices kind of form shadow IT organizations because maybe the centralized IT organization isn't responsive to their needs, and they're not getting stuff as fast as they would like. And some manager just takes out a credit card and starts expensing cloud resources. This can happen pretty easily. There is monitoring for it. So some of the providers have monitoring so that you can look to see resources that are on your network or that people are accessing that might be cloud resources. Especially in a large organization, this is something you want to look out for because I don't want to say it's a problem. Typically, it's the IT organization underserving the business. But it can open up glaring security risk, and you can end up with data somewhere where you just don't know, right? Like let's say you're primarily an Azure organization, somebody just starts firing up some Google Cloud storage accounts to do machine learning with. That data is suddenly at risk, and it's not under your control. So having monitoring for this is really important. And then I think the other part of that that's really important is having strong IT leadership that works with the business to avoid those kind of situations. The last thing is your security team up to date on the latest threats. I feel sorry for anybody who works in IT security nowadays. I mean, it's part of my job, but it's not my primary role. But security is so hard because the nature of threats is constantly evolving, and the attack surface is so high, and there are so many vectors. But do you have a security team? If you don't, maybe you want to consider engaging a consulting firm who specializes in security. And we'll talk a little bit more about that with penetration testing later. But having those trusted resources that you can rely on to kind of advise you and guide you can be really beneficial to your organization. So let's presume you've made the journey to the cloud. We've kind of been talking presumptively about migrations and things like that. But once you're in the cloud, what are some things you can do? One of the things that I find the most useful around governance, and I feel like no matter what I talk about in the cloud, as it relates to data, as it relates to security, it all comes back to governance and knowing what is where. And like that example I just gave of having data suddenly in another cloud that you don't know about is a governance killer. But one of the things that the cloud does that I think is really good is they've built these frameworks within the clouds that let us do things like, if you've ever worked with group policy for Windows, Active Directory that is, you can enforce things globally across your domain. You can do the same thing within a cloud provider. And I'll just give you a real basic example of something I have configured in our tenant. If anybody creates new resources, they have to be tagged with a client name and a date that they were created. Just that gives us a way to look and see, maybe that client's no longer working with us. Maybe we don't have, or maybe the resources were created 3 years ago. It gives me a way of pruning them. However, there are a myriad of policies that are predefined that I can use. A lot of these are tied to audits. So if you look in any of the providers, you'll see a listing of predefined policies. And some other examples of policies might be you can only deploy resources in the 5 cloud regions we've approved because for regulatory reasons, we don't want resources to be deployed outside of the EU, for example. That would be another reason. You can also control the sizes of things. You can tie this in to control security. So another example of a policy might be you can't deploy a virtual machine with a public IP address. So these are all kind of things that you can do. And there's a lot of predefined templates that the cloud providers give you. and this is pretty helpful. A lot of these are directly related to audit, and you can just have these automatically deployed as you create new subscriptions and accounts. There's a feature in Azure called Blueprint. There's a similar feature in AWS that I don't remember the name of. But what Blueprint does is it lets you kind of build a blueprint of policies and templates that you want people to be able to work with in your organization. And as new subscriptions get deployed, which happens if you're in a larger organization, you'll tend to have multiple subscriptions or accounts. Those accounts or subscriptions are all subject to all of those policies, so you put all of them in place. So this gives you a kind of a nice amount of control. And one thing I will warn you about, though, is you want to be kind of aggressive on these, but at the same time you want people to be able to work, and you don't want people to start up their own cloud accounts. So kind of be careful with these. Don't go over the top, but do what you have to do. Secure these endpoints. It seems like almost every data breach is related to an open Amazon S3 storage bucket. I always wondered about this, and I've always dabbled with AWS, and I wasn't a heavy user, and I didn't really understand about the notion of having a public storage account. And then I kind of understood it. It's something where if you want to have a public storage account, you can host, say, a static website. So if I want to drop like an HTML file in a storage bucket, I can tie a DNS record to that, point to it, and then that's my static website. So that's the good use case for that. So that's why that functionality exists, and similar functionality exists in Azure. But when I learned about all these data breaches, I figured, maybe it must be like really easy in Amazon to accidentally use a public storage account. Nowadays, at least as of last year, the cloud changes all the time, so I could be wrong. It was pretty hard. You had to make it public in like 3 different places, and there were explicit warnings. So you might ask, why was I even making it public? Well, the issue was I was trying to develop an application, or not develop an application, but plug together 3 different Amazon AWS components, and that relied on storage. And I was getting permissions errors. And where you configure permissions in AWS is messy, and you kind of have to write them in JSON yourself to an extent. There are some places where it's just click buttons. And I didn't have any real data, and I just wanted it to work. And the error messages, the services I were using were spitting back, were basically useless. So I just made it public, and of course it worked because everybody could get access. But that let me see how easy somebody could get into that situation. One of the things about the cloud is you can expose a lot of data, especially for public-facing systems, because it's designed for all use cases, and there are some very valid scenarios where you want to publicly put data out there, anything that's web-facing, obviously. So I don't want to say there's a lot of risk, but there's a lot of risk here. Just Google S3 data breach. And it's not enough here to rely on best practices and policy. If you're a large organization, there's no way you can keep track of all the various development teams or websites that are using cloud resources. So you want to use a tool that's going to kind of have access within your cloud provider and look for those exposed endpoints and can identify and warn you about them so you can track them down. Don't just try to do this yourself. It's kind of a big risk there. So you find a tool in the space and go ahead and use that. Let me just make sure. I thought I had one in my notes, but no, I didn't. But yeah, look for cloud endpoint detection tools, and you'll find a large number of them. So encrypt data in REST and in transit. I have in transit bolded here. Encryption at REST, to me, simply checks an audit checkbox. It was something we had to start doing after Sarbanes-Oxley came into effect. The notion of encrypting data at REST is such that if a storage administrator or a server administrator in our company stole a bunch of hard drives or even stole a server, that they could mount those hard drives in another machine and potentially just start stealing data. Or, if we were shipping our backup tapes, and yes, I'm dating myself by saying backup tapes, offsite to Iron Mountain, the Iron Mountain driver could take the tapes and run off with them if they weren't encrypted. Likewise, they could stop a database service, copy off the database files, and mount them in some other database server. And those are all things that are possibilities. The odds of any of those things happening with the physical security we have in the cloud are extremely, extremely low. That being said, the barrier to entry of encryption at rest in the cloud is checking a box. And for the most part, I think most cloud providers are encrypting their storage and their VM storage volumes and databases by default anyway, so you don't have to even think about it. So absolutely, you should encrypt everything at rest. That being said, encrypting data at rest, as I mentioned, doesn't buy you much. Anybody who has access to those systems sees completely unencrypted data. If we talk about a database that's encrypted at rest, what that means are the data files are encrypted and the backups are encrypted. However, anybody who has access to that database can see all the unencrypted data. Obviously, that's a little bit of a problem. And this is where encryption in transit comes in. SQL Server has a feature called Always Encrypted that I really like the name of because the data is always encrypted in the database. The only time the data is decrypted is when it goes to the application, which has the key to decrypt it. Ideally, you want to know where all of your sensitive data lives so you can audit it for encryption. And this is kind of another one of those places where governance comes in, right? So having strong data governance and understanding where that data lives allows you to encrypt it better. My last bullet point here is the one that's probably the most challenging, and it always is. Admins shouldn't be able to view unencrypted data. That always encrypted feature I just mentioned works that way. Oracle has a similar feature that prevents admins from viewing data. And the trick to that is the applications or the users have to have the key to decrypt the data, but the admins don't. And really the trick to doing this is you need a mechanism. Well, A, it's going to require changes within an application. So sometimes that's going to require code and engineering type changes. And B is having data stores that really support this methodology. If your data stores don't support wherever you're storing data, whether it be S3, Blob, or in a database, if those things don't support that, you're going to have problems with doing it. But ideally, you don't want your admins to be able to view that unencrypted data. And you may say something like, oh, we're a small organization and we trust all of our admins. And I believe you, and I'm sure your admins are all good people, and maybe they've even all been background checked and things like that. However, if that breach I was talking about earlier happens and somebody gets a hold of an admin session and they can now impersonate that person that breached your admin didn't go through a background check and they don't have the same good intentions that your admin did. And yes, they will dump all that data into CSV files and put it on the dark web. So that's why you want to protect your data from admins. It's to protect your admins, actually, and your data. Enable security logging. So this is another thing, and this ties into the whole kind of notion of separating observability and monitoring, in my opinion. Having logs is really, really important into observability. If you don't have logs, it's impossible to know what happened on your systems. It's telling that one of the first things, if you allow a ransomware attack to happen on a test system or a honeypot, one of the first things the code will do is try to disable logging everywhere it can. So logging is wonderful because it lets us know what happened on our systems. I know just troubleshooting this can be very difficult. The cloud providers all have tools that enable log aggregation. You can, of course, use a third-party tool like Splunk, which I think is a really, really nice tool for log and event correlation. You also need to persist those log records long enough to be able to analyze them. Typically, it's going to be like 30 days that your vendors, the cloud vendors, are going to support. Sometimes you can go up to 90. And beyond that, you may have to archive them off. I don't typically recommend storing those logs for longer than 30 days, especially because there's costs associated with that. However, for certain regulatory reasons, you may have to do that. Excuse me. The other thing logging can really help you do is identify misconfigured access. You want to always try to employ the principle of least privileges when you're talking about security and how we do these things. And having the principle of least privileges in place is always a best practice, but it can be hard to identify. And having those logs can let you see if something's been overgranted, hopefully. So intrusion detection tools, this is another area where it's better to buy third-party things. You can do, and you may have, or use native tools from your provider. But don't try to do this yourself. This is something that's really hard. But what these tools do is they monitor, analyze, and respond to network traffic on the cloud and across on-premises systems. These tools are frequently called SIEM, and they'll log any unusual activity. They'll alert on it. They give you a level of monitoring that you can't otherwise have, and they can filter through eons of event data. You won't be able to identify sophisticated attacks without this sort of tooling. If we look at the SolarWinds attack that happened, one of the vendors in this space, CrowdStrike, I believe it was, they were the ones who identified the breach using their own tools. So having intrusion detection tools in place, and this goes well beyond just having basic antivirus or anything like that. Like in Azure, the tool for this would be called Sentinel, and it can go across on-prem systems, and it does a bunch of data collection and analysis in real time. So having a tool like this is very valuable. Understand your compliance needs. So I talked a little bit about log retention and stuff and how that affects cost. But these retention and audit requirements are going to be determined by your specific industry's needs. When I worked in pharma, it was kind of funny because I worked for two different companies, and I worked for one company that was very kind of conservative in terms of what they did in terms of regulatory compliance. So we kept everything forever. We kept our backups for a really long time. And the key thing here is, since everything in the cloud has a cost element to it, the longer you keep those logs and backups and things like that, the more cost you're going to have. The cost of storage tends to be pretty cheap. So if you're a large organization, you may be able to eat it. If you're a startup, it could still be a big thing. But how long you keep things and what you have to audit are just going to be determined by your specific industry's needs. Some geographies may face different requirements than others, and this can be challenging when you're in a multinational corporation. Your EU branch may have to keep more and more specific data longer than your U.S. branch, just because of the way regulations work. And then finally, understand your data locality rules. And I bring this up because a lot of times, especially when you're using a managed offering, even though you think you've deployed to, say, Northern Europe, there are portions of that telemetry data from that service that may not be isolated to that region. I know that's a little confusing, and it really depends on the cloud architecture of the provider and what they're doing with their back-end telemetry. But I know there are some scenarios where data will be flowing through other geographies. And I know the cloud providers have worked to try to avoid that. But if you have high degrees of sensitivity in your organization to data locality, it's a question worth having with your sales team and those providers to understand that locality. Conduct audits and penetration testing. This is something I think that we undervalue a little bit. Having people regularly attack your infrastructure really helps you understand what your vulnerabilities are. It lets you know where those gaps are in your systems. The other thing is auditing both your solutions that you build in-house and your vendors. I've seen a lot of third-party vendor applications, and sometimes they're really nice and sometimes they're really elegant. A lot of times the code they write is really, really bad, and it scares me. So it's important to kind of understand what the vendors are doing and audit them. Especially if you're a large organization and you have the resources to dedicate to this, I think auditing your third-party vendors for applications is really critical because there's a lot of bad applications there. Of course, you should view your access logs in terms of cloud resources to ensure that only allowed access is happening. But auditing and penetration testing are really pretty important because they'll let you identify your gaps pretty quickly, and paying people to do that is kind of an invaluable service. Finally, our final topic, backups, and restores. I have some little bit of controversial things to say here. I'm pretty selective about what I back up in my cloud resources because backups cost money too. It's data storage. One of the things the cloud lets us do is deploy things really fast. So ideally, I want to have a lot of things that I don't have to back up. So if I can deploy my website from source control and I can deploy a new cloud resource to be that website in a couple of minutes, I can do that just as quickly as I could do a restore, and I didn't have to pay for the backup. Likewise, we tell a lot of our customers that have database servers in the cloud that only back up their databases and don't back up the whole server because it can be faster to build a new server and then start restoring the databases than it is to restore the entire server and bring it back. All that being said, so have a backup plan. If you're to that level of thinking, you're at way in the advanced tier of backup control, and you have a really good understanding of your applications, and that's awesome. But by default, backup, I would way rather have too much stuff backed up than not enough. So back up your resources. There's really no excuse for not doing this in the cloud. I think one of the challenges we always had in an on-prem world was just getting enough physical storage to have backups of everything, all of our environments. In the cloud, you effectively have limitless storage. And unless you're talking about having exabytes of data to back up, you can deploy all the storage you need within several minutes. The cloud providers make it really easy to back up your resources. One good thing that I want to mention here, question to ask to your providers is if you are using platform as a service offerings, you want to understand what the backup methodology that the cloud vendor is using for this. Typically, that's going to be part of part of the benefit you get of using a platform as a service offering is it's going to have managed backup. But you want to understand what that is. One of the things I learned last month was with Amazon's database offering, RDS, if you're using SQL Server for RDS, the backup solution actually takes a snapshot of the entire volume that SQL Server is running on and not of individual databases. So you can't restore an individual database on RDS, which was something I did not know. You can do your own backup separately, so they do give you that option. But understand for this platform as a service offerings what your backup strategy and what your recovery strategy is going to look like. And then finally, restore. There's no good backup until you restore it. And one of the things that's nifty about the cloud is we have all that unlimited storage, and we can spin up compute as we need. So it can be really easy to conduct regular restore testing of your database and server backups. I'm not saying you have to do this every time you do a backup. You might want to if you care about that level of detail. But it does become much easier to do that level of backup or the level of restore testing in the cloud. In the on-prem world, it was really hard because you had to get somebody to give you storage, you had to get somebody to give you VMs, and those weren't really making money. Whereas in the cloud, yeah, it costs money, but you're also using those resources temporarily, so you're only using them for a couple of hours to test your restores, or maybe even a day. But you can easily quantify what it's going to cost and how you can protect your data that way. To kind of close out, training and understanding is very important. You really understanding the cloud that you're on and what the options are and where the security risk in that cloud is really important to me. That's something to me that's probably the most critical thing, because if you don't know what the best practices are, or you don't know more importantly, you don't know where the risks are, that's something that I always kind of worry about. So get that training in place. Make sure your IT staff knows what they're doing. Make sure your organization knows what the risks are and how to avoid getting attacked. understand logging in your environment and the same tools you might have available to you. These are those endpoint management tools I was discussing earlier that can protect you. You want to monitor all of your endpoints and look for new endpoints that are maybe open on your network or in your cloud that you aren't aware about and that are publicly available. Encrypt all the things you can. Remember, it's going to be easy to encrypt things at rest. Encrypting things at transit is going to be a lot harder. So understand what your options are there. And then finally, we can't emphasize this enough, make sure your backups work. And one thing I didn't mention on the last slide, but I think is really important, is to understand that if you have those backups, right, how are they stored within the cloud? And I know some details about how Microsoft does this that I can't publicly discuss, but you want to ensure that the backups are stored in such a way that if somebody compromises your cloud account, they just can't go in and delete your backups. Obviously, the kind of classic ransomware thing is backups are stored on some file share that's on the same flat network as the domain controllers. Somebody gets access to a domain controller, they just encrypt everything. So understand what the backup solution you're using does and how it stores things and how that can protect you against those sorts of attacks. All right, it's time to take a few questions. John, what do we have out there?
Thanks, Joey. So I want to remind everybody that you can still type your questions into the Q&A box at any time, and here we go. So Anthony is wondering, do you have any recommendations for a common security stack/vendor to use as a standard across multiple CSPs? Like AWS, Azure, and Google.
Yeah. There are a lot of vendors in this space. I typically want to avoid recommending a single one. But I mean, to me, I like to kind of recommend people work with who they're comfortable with. Like I think because like there's a ton of vendors in the space, and some of them are pure security vendors. Some of them cover other things. Like Datadog's an example of like a cloud aggregation tool that works across clouds. You have but they do kind of security and performance, whereas you have other tools like Sophos that are more focused on just security. So I don't want to just like make a blanket recommendation there. But yeah, there are a number of good tools in the space. I think have a look, understand how they're priced, how they meet your needs, talk to some other maybe industry peers to get their opinions on them, and kind of look at it from that angle.
Okay. That's a great answer, despite you asked the question. Okay, Robert is.
So it's going to be honest. I do a lot of work for a lot of vendors in this space, and I'm really hesitant. Yeah, I'm really hesitant to just name one because I honestly don't think there's a single best tool. That's my honest answer. I don't think there's a single best tool in the space. They each have kind of nuances that are going to be a little different.
Understood. Okay, Robert is wondering the same thing I was wondering. Are there a few good sites for new threat announcements that we should be watching?
RedmanMag.com. that was a little bit self-serving. Redmond is actually a pretty good one, especially in the Microsoft space. I'm on Twitter a lot, and I follow a bunch of security people. So I go to a lot of sites that I don't know the names of because I just follow links from people I trust, more than like going to a few specific sites. The most obvious one I would recommend is the federal government Chief Information Security Officer site. They do a pretty good job of identifying like major threats, especially where we are right now. And I'd recommend that. But I mean, kind of the standard IT news sites. The main ones I'll name are going to be Redmond, but you know all the other sites that are both in the 1105 media family and not in the 1105 media family.
Yeah. So follow the tech press.
Yeah, basically. Follow TechPress on Twitter, and you'll get links to stuff.
Okay, Kevin is wondering, what is the biggest threat to protecting your data in the cloud? Is it misconfigurations, botnets, insider threats?
I would say the biggest threat is misconfiguration. Botnets, insider threats, nation-state attackers, they all exist and they're a risk. But those things are all looking for misconfigurations. I'll give you a brief example that I've probably shared way too many times, but Benny, who I work with, and I were really bored one day at a customer office. And so we wanted to see how long it would take us to get a SQL server breached on the internet. So we both spun up a VM and a cloud provider, opened port 1433, which is the default port that SQL Server runs on the internet, and set the system administrator password to password. We both then enabled tracing on the box so we could see what was going on. It took about 15 minutes and 7 login tries, and both of our boxes were quickly breached. So all those things are threats, but the way they get there is misconfiguration. I mean, you hear about these very sophisticated attacks, but most attacks that happen are just very, very simple. Something was wide open, somebody figured it out and attacked it.
Gotcha. Okay, Bill is wondering if you could explain the difference between encryption at rest and in transit.
Okay, yeah, this is easy. So encryption at rest just means, let's assume I have a file that's a Word document. By default, as it's stored on a hard drive, you could mount that file to another machine and examine the contents of that file without any limitations. If that file is encrypted, if that drive, I should say, is encrypted at rest, you can examine that file. You're just going to see encrypted ciphertext. That means nobody can. So, like, if you have a laptop that's been built in the last 10 years, your hard drive is probably encrypted at rest. If you have a Mac or a Windows laptop, they're BitLockered, and I forget what Apple calls it. In the parlance of like how database systems work, encrypted at rest also typically means that any backups you take of that data are also going to be encrypted files. Encryption in transit means that any data that's going over the network, or in the case of a database system, data within the database is also encrypted. So if I have a database that's encrypted at rest, so in Oracle and SQL Server both, the feature is called transparent data encryption. Anybody who has access to that database and is querying it, is looking at the database through a query tool or Excel, is going to see plain text data. They're not going to see anything encrypted because that data is only encrypted at the file level. What that means is anybody who has access to the database has access to all of the data. So where encryption in transit would step in is both going over the network and in the database. That data would be stored as encrypted ciphertext, so they couldn't see anything.
Okay. Let's see here. This is interesting. Victoria's wondering, is pen testing dangerous?
Only if you don't pay your pen testers. Penetration testing is a very kind of controlled thing. It's kind of a lot like disaster recovery testing, in my opinion, except it is hitting your live systems. But penetration testers do act in a manner where they're trying to penetrate stuff, but they don't want to do any damage. So they're only going to look for where they got in and then leave. And then the reports are going to say where they were able to get in and what method they were able to use to get in.
Okay, we've got time for just 2 last questions here. Let's see. This seems like kind of a big question. How do you secure your backups? I mean, it's kind of a very broad, but do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question.
Okay, good.
And this goes into kind of what I was talking about. It's really important to understand the entire life cycle of your backups, especially if you're using a managed backup service, which is what the clouds have. You want to understand what happens if somebody deletes a backup in your cloud, and what's that process look like? You kind of, one of the tenets of like modern security is that you just always assume that you're breached. So you want to assume an attacker can go into your control plane and delete a backup, and you want to understand how you can be alerted on that and what the ramifications are for that. The cloud provider or backup vendor absolutely should never say, oh, as soon as you click delete, that backup is now gone forever, because that is the wrong answer. You want to make sure there's some additional protections around the backup solution that allow for kind of a soft delete process, or even a tertiary key that requires two operators to be in place to gain access to do things like that. So really, you want to understand what your protections are. And we kind of joke about this because it is such an old solution, but tape backups are really great because they're offline. And I'm kind of not kidding when I say that. Ironically, and Amazon was using optical storage, I think, for their archival Glacier storage tier, but Azure announced in 2017 that they use tape. They couldn't get the cost of disk down any further, so that for the archive storage in Azure, and it's kind of backed up if you look at their SLAs, because it's nearline, so you can read them. They keep the metadata about the files online, so that's on hard drives, but the objects themselves are on tape because it takes 3 or 4 hours for them to get you the file in a way you can use it.
Wow, what's old is new.
Yeah, I mean, it's offline. Can't beat offline media for security.
We are out of time. Gosh, Joey, thank you so much for a great session.
Thanks, Sean.
So many thanks to Joey D'Antoni for this awesome session, and to our sponsors, Metallic and Island, for making it possible. We are going to take a very short break, but we'll be back right around the top of the hour for a second session, Expert Cloud Data Backup and Recovery Best Practices, which will be presented by Karen Lopez, Data Evangelist for Info Advisors, and moderated by my colleague, Digital Content Specialist and Editorial Jack of all trades, Chris Paoli. Now would be a great time to check out those extra resources on your console provided by our sponsors. And remember, during today's third session, we will be giving away a sweet Alienware M15 gaming laptop. But you got to be there to win, so stay tuned. Back in a few.
Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, my fellow moderators, and of course, our sponsors, Metallic and Island, for underwriting this summit and allowing us to bring you this great content. My name is Chris Paoli, editor, and I am here to moderate the second session of our Cloud Data Protection and Disaster Recovery Summit, called Expert Cloud Data Backup and Recovery Best Practices. Our speaker for this session is Karen Lopez, Data Evangelist for Info Advisors, Space Enthusiast, and NASA Datanaut. Karen is a Senior Project Manager and Architect with an extensive background in development processes and information management. She specializes in taking practical approaches to systems development. She has 20-plus years of public speaking experience, which includes keynotes, speeches, and demonstrations. She wants attendees to have fun, gain insight, and take away inspiration for working with new technologies and methods. She's known for her slightly irreverent and practical approach to IT training and speaking. Take it away, Karen.
Thanks so much. The other thing I wanted to point out is, first of all, I'm so happy that those of you are giving up, a Friday, if that's what day it is where you are, to come talk to me about something I'm so passionate about, and that is that I don't believe in backups. I'll just let that sink in for a minute. And the reason I say that is I only believe in restores. I say this all the time. It's my shtick, is that we do not need any backups. What we need are restores and recovery. So I say that for the shock value, and I want you to say that to your teams and your colleagues to remind everybody that the best backup strategy is actually the recovery strategy. So that's just going to give you a taste for where I am. I have listed on the screen now my Twitter ID, my Facebook ID, and my LinkedIn ID. I would love to follow you, friend you, and link with you on all of these services. And if you mention that we met here at this event, I'm much more likely to hit that accept button because I know we think the same way. So I just always include the abstract in the session so that we can remember what we're supposed to be talking about. And the one thing I want to say is now that you've been through Joey's presentation, we do have a little bit of overlap between those things. But of course, I'm going to bring my snarky perspective to that as well. The first thing I'd like for you to do is start posting your questions now. I'm going to accept questions right in the middle of my presentation. I told the organizers the reason I do this is I so miss in-person speaking engagements where people can shoot up their hand and say, wait, I thought we're supposed to love backups, or can you please explain this further? I want you to be able to ask those questions, and it's okay to ask them now. The other thing is, because this particular presentation, I'll be sharing a lot of stories, I would love if you could share a brief story about some backup or recovery successes or failures or gotchas that you've heard about. And we're going to talk about that on the next slide for a second. The other thing is that this presentation uses the concept of best and worst practices. Now, one of the things that that I have discovered in my 30-plus years of consulting work is that sometimes management thinks the word best practice means that you are striving to turn their organization that they feel is just barely still floating above water into some elitist, best practice, Olympic gold medal, worldwide championship organization. And I'm here to say today that when I use best practice, I do not mean some elitist, high-tech, CERN-level practice. I mean this is the way a professional should be doing it. These are the practices that will keep their business in business, among other things. And then when I say worst practice, it might not actually be the worst thing that's ever been done with backups, although I do have a few of those stories. This is just, lingo that makes for a great headline and a great opening discussion line, but I want to make sure that we're clear on what I mean by best practice. It is literally what legal people call professional level work quality or something like that. The other thing is that if you do share some story or snippet or thing that you heard about as far as backup and recovery successes or failures, that the rule I always have in my presentations is that any stories the audience shares are either publicly known because they made the news, or they're about some half-aunt step sister-in-law's dog groomer's hairstylist who you once met at a wedding and has absolutely nothing to do with any company that you've worked for. So if you want to share a story, you should start about, I heard about this time. That's our agreed rule. No one's sharing stories about their current employer. I also think that my mantra for everything I do, actually everything in my life, but everything in IT, is every decision comes down to cost, benefit, and risk. And if we aren't accounting for those three things, cost, benefit, and risk, we aren't being true professionals. The other qualifier I want to give is that not every best practice applies to every environment, every compliance jurisdiction, every system, every data story. For instance, there are plenty of cases where it makes more sense to reload initial data than to back up the resulting data and their systems and wait to install the whole, restore the whole thing. This particular scenario is more common in a lot of very large analytical and warehouse scenarios, especially those in cloud services where you don't have as much control as you would for an on-prem system. So that particular trade-off of whether backup or reload is what works for you goes beyond this particular session, but it is an example where cloud and very, very large data systems might have different best practices. So when I say everything comes down to cost, benefit, and risk, I mean every decision that you make about backups and restores. So I want to talk about some of the words that I'll be using through these things. My background is as a data modeler, data management professional, part-time wannabe DBA. So I'm good about sort of putting some context about the words I use. So if I say it's a successful restore or a backup, I mean that you are successful. We all want you to be successful, that your backups are successful, that your restores are, that the business is back to business. But what a successful restore or backup does not mean is I did it and there were no errors thrown. I'm going to talk about that in just a minute with a real story. When I say recovered, I mean you. Recovering from the stress of a system outage. No matter how much I practice restores, when I'm doing a real restore from a down system, that's stressful, even though I've practiced it. But because I've practiced it lots of times, it's just a good stress. It's not the, oh my gosh, where are the backups? Oh my gosh, I hope this works. I want the business to recover. That's our ultimate goal. Who cares if the database has been recovered if the business hasn't recovered? And I want this to be, because I'm Data Chick on Twitter, I want a successful recovery, meaning that we have returned our systems and our data to supporting the business, because we all love data, right? When I say you've tested a backup or tested a restore, I don't mean it worked with no errors thrown. This is the most common sort of entry-level, pre-expert experience that I have to deal with. In fact, this happened to me just this week, that someone reported they tested something and it was great, so they did it with the test data and they went ahead and applied it in production. But it didn't work, even in development. The only thing that they thought, for testing was that it didn't throw any errors. And it turned out the restore corrupted data that it didn't need to corrupt. The other thing is that one of the things that kind of blows your mind when you're new to backup and disaster recovery is that you might have designed in your recovery strategy to include some data loss. And most people think about, when they first come into IT and do enterprise backup and restores, is that every restore has to bring you back to a perfect setting. No, we negotiate these things to based on our restore times and our restore points. For instance, if you're doing weekly full backups, daily incrementals, and hourly incrementals, like if you're not doing a streaming type of backup, which most enterprise systems do not do, you might say, we're going to negotiate that we can restore to within 24 hours of the last set of backup data. We might say that, depending on the system. And again, that all comes down to cost, benefit, and risk. That means that there may be some data loss, and that data loss may be by design, because what's going to happen is, depending on the system, maybe data will be recaptured, re-entered, re-imported, and that's part of the trade-off of cost, benefit, and risk. So when I say practice, I do mean both versions of the term. I meant the practice that means doing it over and over again till you're confident and you're good at it and it's less stressful to do it. But I also mean it in the term of a mental mindfulness practice of, you know how it works. When you're working in backups and restores, You're focused on what's happening now, what's not focused on what's happened in the past, not what's going to happen in the future. You're practicing a mindfulness around restoring your data. So I'm playing with that word there. Also, the other thing that's, yep. Great.
Oh, we actually have a question that kind of, I don't know if you're actually going to cover this in the next few minutes, but Robert was just wondering, is there actually a template for incident response that is a good jumping off point for creating those recovery plans?
That's a great question. So yes, there are lots of templates. I'm not going to endorse any one particular thing, but if you look for incident response templates, I'm sure you'll get a lot of opportunities to either some free ones that the community has shared, which you have to evaluate again based on cost, benefit, and risk. And of course, there are ones that you can purchase that are generally backed up with better documentation, more configurations available for it. And of course, there are people you can hire to help you take those templates and make it work for your particular environment and your particular cost, benefit, and risk needs for sure. And even if you don't get an external one, you have to develop these strategies yourself. And I'm going to talk about that on a future slide too. Anything else?
That's it so far. We have a lot of skepticism about your recovery, no backup statement earlier, but no direct questions so far.
Okay. Well, I'll take a look at those at the end because I am saying it to be snarky. So if it instituted doubt, that's my plan. Let's talk about that at the end. The other thing is, one of the things that both the cloud and modern sort of infrastructure developments is that, I used to think of data as, the business's data in the database in file storage, data in spreadsheets, data in JSON, like the actual business data. But I've been one who's been talking a lot about, as we move to more software-defined or software-driven storage and networks and databases and all of those things, that software-defined isn't just software. It's really configuration data, right? So this storage that, what used to be a physical LUN or file server or massive hard drive array is now what I would call a logical one. It's a separation and abstraction from the physical to the logical. And when we configure that software-defined stuff, we are also creating data there. And in my experience, we aren't treating that infrastructure data, or sometimes people call it metadata, as well as we're treating the business data. And so we need to apply the same backup and recovery strategies to all of this software-defined data as well. Sure, they're probably stored, again, in a JSON file somewhere, probably in a DevOps process. But if we needed to get to that data, would we really need to restore everything in that process, all the codes, all the scripts, all the automation? Or should we be treating this massive amount of new data that most people don't think of as data as needing backups and restores? And I want everyone to think that as things become software-defined, that also means they're becoming more data-defined, and that we need to love that data the same way. The other thing I wanted to point out is a lot of my experience is with databases, so a lot of my stories are based on that, but it's the principles and the practices that I'd like for all of you to draw from this, whether or not your focus is on database recovery or storage recovery or system recovery. And there are many best practices, sort of the things you would see if you attended a session on Backup and Recovery 101 or introductory sessions. We're not going to talk about them too much just because I want to talk about these other things that I've learned along the way. So, but I will give a shout out to the things that I think are important. Back up everything, always be backing up. So see, I'm even going against my snarky comment. Always back up. Always. Don't let people say, we'll get to that later, or that's the next phase. Just start backing up. I definitely try to use the 3-2-1 thing about backups, which is a good starting place for thinking about the fundamentals of backups and restores, that your data should have 3 copies of the backup in at least 2 different places and at least 1 away from the systems that you're backing up, typically off-site or in the cloud. So 3-2-1. Just make sure when people says, oh, it's backed up, when you're verifying that you're looking for at least 3 copies in at least 2 different places and 1 of them away from the data and systems that you're backing up. You should always test your backups. I'm going to talk about that a lot. That's part of my snarky comment of we don't need backups. The business only needs restores. But the other thing is that you need to test your restores. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute as well. So let's talk about worst practices. And I just want to shout out that I found a stock image of someone with pink hair. So for the last couple of years, I've been rocking pink hair, and I never saw myself in stock photos. I was happy to find this one. Let's talk about this worst practice, letting a non-expert touch the system that is experiencing some sort of outage. Now, this sounds elitist, and I'll admit that. But what I mean by a non-expert, I don't mean a world-famous consultant in backups and restoring. What I mean is someone who has experience with your systems, with your tools, your files, your systems, an expert in your backup and recovery, everything, systems, practices, processes. And I'm sure I'm not the only one that has experienced this, but in some shops, IT shops, there's this immediate panic if a system's down. Like people are sending emails, people are calling people and texting people. A manager has shown up and is standing behind your desk. He's asking you or she's asking you to restore this system, get it back up and running. You can connect to it, but the data's not there. It's all gone. And they're going to stand over your shoulder and watch you while you do this to make sure you do it right, even though they have zero idea what it would take to do it right. But what if it was a system you had no authority over, you had no idea where the backups were, there was no documentation on restores and backups, you were starting from a blank page? What would you do then? I mean, your boss is standing behind you, and you're starting from basically zero knowledge. What are you going to do? What I would do is say, we need to find the person who knows how to do this. Even though I have restored a bazillion databases over my life, I'm not the person to come to restore your database. Even though I have some good practices. I've done it before. I've used the tools that do this. I am not the expert in your systems, your backups, your pre-negotiated RPOs and RTOs, all of that. An expert also understands how we shouldn't just go in and try some stuff and fiddle with the I'm going to use the word target system throughout this. And what I mean by target system is I just mean the system that's experiencing some sort of data or system outage. An expert knows to not jump in and start trying things. And yet we see this all the time in places, especially that have a very low maturity model when it comes to dealing with outages or documentation or governance, those things. Let's just say that they are all agile from the developer up to the executive. They get things done fast, but they fail fast as well. I'm going to tell you about a story. So the title of this is, I forgot to say, for this session is Expert Best Practices and Insights. And a lot of the insights I'm sharing are about stories, like real world stories I've experienced. So I worked at a sort of a regional retailer where the backups for the database were on the same drive as the database system and the database files. Now, that is not a best practice at all. but it's also very common, especially if your database tools had a default of backing up to the same area as where the database is. Because we know that non-experts love defaults in system configurations. They often mistake defaults in tools and systems as being a vendor-endorsed best practice. They aren't. They are a vendor-endorsed, we don't know where your backups should go, so we're going to point to the one thing we know about your system, which is the local hard drive. It's all it knows. So all the backups for this system were on the same drive as the database, and when that hard drive failed, the backups were inaccessible too. Like, this sounds like something that no one would ever do in real life, and I cannot tell you how many times this has happened, and I've seen it happen. In one of the places I worked, backups were being stored on a server, but it wasn't really a server. It was a reused desktop under some sysadmin's desk, because that was the two different places in 321. And someone had initially decided to put some system backups on this server that other people thought was in the data center, but it was really a server underneath a sysadmin's desk. But the system got what the company called water damage, but we all knew was coffee damage, which is usually a laptop thing, but can also happen to regular old school desktops. And therefore, the backups were inaccessible. Now, that sysadmin thought he was doing the right thing because these backups were of the development pre-production QA systems. But what he didn't realize was, to a developer, the development environment is production. To a QA tester, the QA system is production. So while customer data wasn't really impacted, development was offline for a very long time, and therefore developer production was out. So I also worked on a project where a non-DBA was trying to recover a database backup, but he had no idea what he was doing. He had never used any of these database tools. The DBA wasn't responding. So this other storage admin, quite an expert in backups and restores, thought he would Google some things and go on and do a restore. But while he was doing this, he accidentally did a backup and overwrote the last database backup. Now, there were still other backup sets from prior times, but he had actually just overwritten the last backup, which meant recovery and restoring the business to being back in business took longer. My other favorite one is, so in many database systems, but specifically in SQL Server, the transaction log files are not what the rest of the world calls log files. They weren't just, notes being taken by a system. They are actually the transactions that still haven't been fully applied to the database. And if you're doing incremental backups, you need all those log files to get back to where you were. But someone was trying to do a restore. They were trying to bring the backed up data onto the server where the database was, but there wasn't enough hard drive space. So he did what normal humans do, is look through this database server to see where he could, get rid of some files. So he got rid of the transaction log files because, of course, everyone knows, I'm being snarky here, everyone knows that log files aren't needed to restore a file. But it was because he didn't understand how database files work, and he just got rid of them. So that took a longer time to recover. The main thing to remember is even experts aren't perfect. But non-professionals doing restores is often going to be more harmful than having the business wait until we can get the person who has access to the incident response log or documentation that knows where the the right backups are, not just the files on the server with the latest date. That's a trade-off that you have to do in doing incident response, is if the person who would normally do it or the team who would normally do it isn't responding, it may be better for the business to wait until someone who is an expert can come in and do it. And the best mitigator to this, though, is, of course, don't have a single point of failure when it comes to restores, but also having detailed, the D word, documentation and instructions on how to recover. And if you've practiced restores, it's probably even automated so that people that aren't familiar with everything can do a successful restore. The other thing I want to point out is that this isn't always mentioned in a disaster recovery session, but one of the most reasons that people do backups of database systems is to create a set of development data. And I've been on a long rant that we should not use production data for development testing or development data. And often I'll have a DBA say, oh, we don't have to practice our restores because we do backups all the time for the developers, and they restore those backups on their development environment, and that's how restores get tested. Now, this is a gross misunderstanding of what it means to recover for the business. Restoring a backup to a developer's machine is not a test of recovering for the business. And the reason for that is that the developer isn't going to go in to see, is all the data there? Was all of it restored successfully? What was the last? Did it meet the restore point objective? Did it restore the data in the correct format? Because they don't care about that. They're not running their business in their development environment. They're just wanting to test their code. But this often leads to people putting backups in what Joey just talked about, a misconfigured storage area. Remember, production data is often well protected in the production system, but once we take it out of there, it often has little to no protection at all. And I bet that a majority of the data breaches we see that happen due to open S3 buckets are not because a production backup was put there for production recovery purposes, but it was stored in a bucket to share, let's say, with a colleague developer or the off-site development team or the people on the other floor, and it got shoved into an open S3 bucket so that someone else could pick it up and restore it to QA or development. I'm going to bet that's a lot of the data breaches we have. And while that doesn't really have anything to do with disaster recovery, it does have to do with not having a data breach. So my last story is about letting a non-expert manager decide your recovery strategy. I worked on a project where we were way behind, lots of things were going wrong, and, it was just one of those months. And I brought up the fact that I had not seen any backups of production systems, of developer systems, of QA systems, and that I wanted to know if things were being backed up. And the answer I got was not yet. Yes, I was told by a manager and by the development team that production did not have an in-place automatic 3-2-1 backup solution. And it turned out that was true. And I said, this is something, we need to drop everything we're doing now and start backing up production. And a manager screamed at me, we do not have time for this now. We've got more important things to do. And I actually accidentally cussed in response to that because it had so blown my mind that a company was not backing up their production systems and felt it was a blocker to getting anything else done. In my world, man, if your production systems are out and you have no backups so that you can do recovery, that's just an unacceptable risk in the whole cost-benefit risk. But this particular story took an even more evil twist, which I'll talk about later. So let's talk about a best practice now. Now that I've gloomed and doomed you into this, I think that people totally underrate the experience of practicing restores and recovery. And this even came to light this very week. I was working on a project where we were going to need to do some updates to a system by loading some data in. So this wasn't a backup data set. It was loading new data in. It was new to us business processes, new to us data. But in order to import data into this system, you know, it was software as a service system, so it wasn't a traditional backup. It was an export of data, messing with it and importing it again because we didn't have access to the actual underlying database. So we created I had to push to do test data because we don't have a development system for a long story, but because it's a software as a service solution. And so an admin created some test data. We all went through it, said, yeah, do the test data import, and then we'll delete those things later. And he did it and said it worked really well, except that his data was in the wrong format for dates. And he didn't realize that. But some of the dates, because they were valid dates everywhere in the world, but they'd just be wrong in some places, were accepted. But some of the dates were invalid because of the date format, so the whole row was rejected. Now, this is an import story, but the same thing can happen if your backup strategy is not a restore one, but a reload the data strategy like I talked about previously. So this row was not restored. But he reported the test import worked perfectly. We're ready to go because it didn't throw an error message. So he did the full production load only to find out that we corrupted a bunch of customers' data because the date formats were wrong in the import file and a lot of the imports. And now we're going through and trying to figure out what data was corrupted, how we're going to fix it, how we're going to deal with the financial impacts of the wrong dates, meaning it's going to trigger a bunch of other processes. And this says to me that an awful lot of people don't understand what we mean by a restore. It doesn't just mean it ran with no smoke coming out of the machine. And this person is a sysadmin, so they should at least understand these concepts. I've also, and we have probably all heard of places where they were diligently doing backups, but only did restores when they needed to, and when they went to do the restore, it failed. And there was and the backups were corrupted, or the format was wrong, or the backups had been made with no error message, but they didn't actually exist. And this is why your management, you need to be telling management that we need to always be restoring data, always testing restores. In one case, I worked at a client where the backup media, so I think it was tapes at the time, and I'm glad Joey brought that up as a security practice, but the tapes were being placed in boxes. The boxes were left with the security guard at the front door so that the backup tape storage people could come pick them up. But sometimes the table they were left on in the guards area couldn't hold all the boxes, so some went on the floor, and the cleaning people were happily throwing away the boxes on the floor, and we didn't discover that that meant some of our backups were missing until we had to do a system outage restore. And there was no way to get those backups back because they were long gone. That's why you need 3 copies in 2 different places, hopefully one off-site. The other thing that people forget about, especially in modern systems, is it's not enough to just back up data. You have to back up the encryption keys, sometimes license keys. Sometimes, if you're restoring to a new system, the licensing scheme requires you to go back to the vendor to get a new license because it's hardware-constrained licensing. These are things that you would find out if you tested a restore. one of my favorite things. Now, I've seen this quote a lot of times, but it is attributed to Gary Williams of we should treat every backup, we should call it Schrodinger's backup, which says that the condition of any backup is unknown until a restore is attempted. Like, I want to print this on T-shirts. The other popular story about practicing restores is the story of Toy Story 2. The headlines were kind of misleading, but the full story is that a woman on parental leave happened to have the only backup as they were building and developing Toy Story 2. It was on her laptop at home, and that was how they were able to recover the film and not have to start again. I can't imagine all of that time and all of that data that's used in building a large animated film wouldn't have had multiple backups in multiple places and at least one off-site. But thank goodness they had a remote worker. You can tell your boss the reason you want to be a remote worker is you have an accidental backup of their systems, which may or may not be true. And then one other, like one of the reasons why I'm so adamant about doing testing restores is that I'm kind of embarrassed to tell this story, but this is why. It's my own personal story. I had an employee who was a sysadmin who worked for me, and he was doing bad things, embezzling money, selling off customer lists, selling off contracts that I had acquired, and he stopped the backup process for my systems here in my little tiny office because he didn't want there to be any evidence. And then he went into the backup systems and deleted all the backups. And I'm not the only one this has happened to. A malicious sysadmin, someone who has access to these things, can bring down your recovery just by being a disgruntled employee. And if I had been testing my restores, I would have known right away that the backups were deleted. I would have known that backups had been turned off. And I have truly learned my lesson here. I thought I was too small to worry about it, and now that I'm the only person working here, I still test my restores. So another worst practice that I see, another worst practice I see is installing anything on the target systems. People who are non-experts tend to do this in an effort to recover faster because everybody's panicking. So the story I have about this is a sysadmin who went in and was called in as a consultant to come in and help restore a system. But when he logged into the database server, he was confused. All he saw was a command line, and that was because the client was following a really great best practice and restoring and deploying only Windows Core, which is the bare essence Windows installation for a server. It makes all kinds of security reasons to do this, but when he got there, he had never worked with command line, and he didn't know how to work with command line. He didn't know how to do it. So he started installing tools, and he started trying to install Windows. He had no idea what he was doing, and he didn't even know that he could have installed all of these recovery tools on another system and pointed them to this database. So while he was in there struggling, he actually delayed the restore of the business. So this is the best practice. Don't install stuff on the targeted system unless there's a plan for it. And it's always better to try to use recovery systems from a separate system that can connect to the down system in order to work. The less you fiddle with the targeted system, the better off you will be. This is my other favorite one. There's a lot of stories here. You go to do a restore, but you haven't practiced your restores, and you find out you don't actually have access to the backups. You don't have the encryption keys. You don't have a login to the recovery system. You don't have enough licenses for the fifth person on the team to log in. What about, in one case, my client was sending backup media to, instead of a backup media storage, like something that specializes in backups, they were sending them to just a regular storage type thing, like an air-conditioned, environmentally protected storage, but somebody who stored all kinds of things. And the rule in their contract was they could only release items to the person on the contract. But the person on the contract was long gone from the company, and it took basically getting legal intervention and a judge's order to get access to their backups. And I'm going to tell you that took a long time. The other one was there was backup media for the dev environment, again, because people forget that dev is production for devs. And the backups for dev and Q&A were stored in an IT person's home. But that person was away. And the reason he was away was that police had come in with a warrant and captured all the media in his home. So no one had any access to the backups because they were under legal possession. The best practice, now notice this is different, shared access to resources, but don't overshare. There should never be a single person being the only person who has access to backups and restores. So I worked with a sysadmin who went on vacation. I think she went on her honeymoon, so it was a couple weeks, and no one had access because she had actually, even though she had said that she had granted everyone access to the backups, she actually hadn't done that in a way that they could get access to it. And no one had ever tested those restores, and therefore no one knew that the people who actually were supposed to have access didn't. So you have to balance sharing this responsibility with not oversharing it, like making everyone an admin, but this is something that you have to do. My other favorite one is people ignore physics. And the reason this happens is that they've heard at least one copy off-site, and preferably not in the same building or block as where your backups or where your systems are. But people take this to an extreme and put it maybe on the other side of the planet because that's safer, but they don't realize getting that data back over the internet is constrained by the law of physics. And if you believe you can performance tune your way around physics, I want you to DM me on Twitter right now and tell me how, and we can both become the richest person in the world. Because you can't bend physics yet. So that means you want your recovery resources near your target system, and this becomes much more apparent in cloud systems because you have so many opportunities for putting your backups far away, close, any of those things. So you want it near enough, but you might not want it in the same data center because if the data center has a failure, then your backups are not accessible, and you have to do that cost, benefit, and risk for those the location of your restore resources. Now, a worse practice is trying to use what I call POBUs, which are plain old backup systems to do your cloud restorations. And by plain old, I mean downloaded scripts. I mean systems that were designed to do only on-prem backups, and you love them, they're good, but there's all kinds of reasons why this won't work on the cloud. Maybe it can't connect to modern connection strings. Maybe it has problems with latency because of physics of maintaining a connection. Maybe it won't do a backup at all as software as a service because there's no way to do a native backup. The worst practice is trying to stretch a tool that wasn't designed to work on new cloud modern systems to try to fake out backups and recovery. It's just not going to work. And the best thing I want to point to, the new hot, sexy thing, is to put your backups in confidential computing so that you can have tamper-evident storage or even physically blocked. So confidential computing or security enclaves is a combination of compute and hardware and software that means that people can't mess with your backups. So Joey talked about gap between your backups, like with tapes. That's one way of making things tamper-proof, is if they can log into the system but they can't get to the backups, then they can't mess with the backups. But this, because of ransomware, is the way to do it. Store your backups using confidential computing where they can't be deleted, they can't be tampered with, they can't be encrypted through ransomware. But in order for that to work, you have to have separation of duties. And that means if I store my backups in confidential computing, the same person, the same login, the same team who does restores and maintains system availability cannot have access either physically or through a login to that storage of the backups. That's the separation of duties. The other best practice is to understand how cloud backups and recovery are the same and different as on-prem backup and recovery. I've worked with some wonderful continuity planning, business resumption planning people who have only experience in on-prem stuff. They're fantastic at it. But when they go to attack a cloud backup and recovery thing, they're not familiar with cloud concepts or how software as a service works, and they really just can't apply those things. The days are gone. Don't just download a script that does backups, because it's not going to be aware of all of these things. This is similar to doing plain old backup system solutions, but it's worse. It might work for your dev test environment, but it's definitely not up to speed for doing modern cloud-based recovery. And the other thing that people always throw in the cloud is priced differently, and you need to do your cost benefit and design solutions based on that difference. And then my last tip that people forget is that you should scale your systems in the cloud to make backup and recovery faster. I've worked with clients who are taking forever to do a recovery, and I'm like, scale up the server, reconfigure the server to optimize restores. Yes, it's going to cost you more money, but it might take a day off your restore. Okay, that might be an exaggeration, it might not. Scale up your network, scale up your connection, scale up your servers, scale up your storage, get that recovery faster. So these are the things I talked about during all of this, and the last three are: be ready for restores by practicing, always be learning in the cloud, because the cloud means things change every day, and make sure you give yourself kudos and thanks for being successful. So that's all I have for today. Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, we have time for, I think, a couple of questions. Yeah, that was a great presentation. Based on a lot of comments we received, quite a few of your examples hit pretty close to home with some of our audiences, especially some of the horror stories. So I don't know if they were happy for you reminding them of their hard times, but
I think the horror stories are important for management to hear, right? And you should tell them success stories too, but the horror stories they need to know about.
And that's a good point. That segues right into our first question. What do we do if we can't get management to invest in real-time backup systems?
Tell them, I don't know, go on strike. I don't know. This is the classic one, like the executive who told me we don't have time. Like that literally took 2 years to get management to agree to do backups. And along the way, a sysadmin decided, oh, I know how to do backups. I'll turn on archiving for this system. So that's what he did. And, of course, that's not a backup at all. And, it wouldn't have allowed recovery. But that put us off for another year because we had been told backups had been put in place. I mean, it really took a change in management for that problem. But other times, if you can point to them about backup or restore failures or calculate the cost of the system being down to really make it cost, benefit, and risk. If you speak cost, benefit, and risk, that's what managers and executives talk. They don't care about what the bank or the government or what Sirius recommends. They care about cost, benefit, and risk.
Okay. Who do you think is ultimately responsible for testing, restores, and recoveries?
Well, I will say ultimately the business is responsible for demanding them, testing or restores. They just don't know they have this responsibility or how to make it happen. I think the thing is you use my snarky tagline, is that we don't need backups. We only need recovery. And if we aren't practicing and testing our recovery, it might take us days or weeks. I'm dealing with my dental practice now that had a data outage in December, and they still haven't recovered. And that means my data is messed up. I had to get redone x-rays. I had to reschedule several appointments because they're still trying to recover from whatever data outage they had in December, which I suspect was ransomware.
Okay, it looks like we have time for one more question. I know you highlighted quite a few threats, but in your opinion, what is the biggest threat right now to systems?
People. Like literally. People. Jerry Weinberg says all technical issues come down to a people problem. But when I say people, I'm not just joking. It's like Joey said, misconfiguration or people putting backups unprotected in an open S3 bucket or malicious employees. I mean, we're starting and state foreign actors. Like it really is. Technology isn't the solution. It's the tool to successfully recovering the business. And I think people lose sight of that they get overconfident because, it's encrypted, it doesn't matter. Well, yeah, if you've got the encryption keys, it doesn't matter. But if it's ransomware that has encrypted it, you're kind of out of luck.